Welcome to another episode of Teen Gen Talks, hosted by me, Melissa.
And me, Desiree.
Where the goal is to empower the youth of Glendale and connect youth to community resources, individuals, and organizations through interviews and discussions.
And today we are joined by a special guest, Andrea Arango. Andrea was born and raised in Puerto Rico. She has an EDS in reading education and works as a public school ESOL teacher by day and as a writer by night. Andrea balances her life in Virginia with trips home to see her family and eat lots of tostones de pana. When she's not busy, you can always find her enjoying nature in the nearest forest or body of water. Ivelisse Explains It All is her debut novel.
Don't forget to follow us on our social, on Instagram and Facebook at MyGlendaleLAC. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, and we post videos every Friday at 4:30 p.m. So thank you, Andrea, for taking the time out of your day to talk with us. We have a lot to discuss.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So to start off the interview, you are a public school ESOL teacher. Did you always know that you wanted to start teaching, or when did that passion arise?
No, I didn't always know. I kind of fell into it. I had moved, so I grew up in Puerto Rico, and I had moved to the States and was working kind of my first adult job in Maryland, and then had a family emergency, and so had to move back home for a while. And, it was one of those things where I had majored in English literature, and I was like, what can I do? What job can I have on this island where the main language is Spanish? And so I started teaching English. I started teaching sixth grade. And, I did that for a couple of years and ended up getting my master's in education because I realized that I actually really liked it. And then eventually did leave Puerto Rico, came to Virginia to do a little more grad school, and then have just been in the public schools ever since.
So what is something that your students have taught you that you will always carry with you?
I think just how nuanced everybody's experiences are. I think, as someone who grew up in Puerto Rico, my experience, as a Latina woman is very different from my students who either immigrated in much harder ways than, I just got on a plane. I had my US citizenship. So my experience coming to the States is very different from a lot of my students' experiences, or my students who were born there, but, their parents were undocumented. And just like the wide variety of cultures and races and backgrounds that all of them have. And unfortunately, kind of in the schools, they're lumped together as like everyone who is Hispanic needs like these supports. And so that was something that I try to advocate for a lot, is just the different experiences that we have in our schools and the different resources that we need for those students.
Do you remember when you specifically decided that you wanted to venture into becoming an author, and were books always a part of your life?
Yes, they were always a part of my life. I've always been a reader. That's how my parents bribed me to do anything when I was younger, was with the promise of a book. When I got grounded, they took my books. That was, that was my punishment. And so I did always dream about becoming an author, but I didn't really know that it would ever actually happen. It was just kind of this like pipe dream. Like I would write for fun, but I wasn't actively trying to be a writer. And then a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic hit, I self-published just like a really short novella, just to kind of prove to myself that I could finish a project, I could put it out there, people would read it who were not, my immediate family. And that was really eye-opening to me. It was the first project I actually finished. It was the first project that I let, kind of the general public have access to. And that's what really gave me the confidence in myself to then try to pursue traditional publishing and becoming an author, the regular way.
So can you tell us a bit about your debut novel, Ivelisse Explains It All, and the inspiration behind it?
Yeah, so I wrote Ivelisse Explains It All because first of all, I wanted more middle grade books that touched on mental health. I think that's something that a lot of kids deal with anyways, but especially during these pandemic years, I think, mental health struggles and just limited access to resources and the way the schools were virtual and then we were back, and it has led to a lot of kids who need support and a lot of adults who don't necessarily know how to give them that support. And so I wanted to write a book where the main character kind of knows what she needs, in order to be happy and healthy, but it's kind of the people around her don't always understand. I definitely come from a family where, therapy isn't normal. Even today, in Puerto Rico, it's kids don't need therapy. Kids need, sports or activities, or like it's still seen kind of as a taboo subject. And so I wanted to show, a girl who does go to therapy, who does take pills for, her diagnosed anxiety and PTSD and stuff like that. And it's portrayed as completely okay. And some people in her life get it and some people don't. And how she kind of advocates for herself and just, lets people know what she needs and what she wants. And hopefully people will get it. And the people who don't get it, maybe don't need to be in your circle.
And like you said, mental health is such an important subject that needs to be talked about, whether you're an adult or a kid. So I guess if you could touch upon a little bit more how you approached the topic of mental health in the book, and just, especially because it's a children's book. So how did you tackle that hard subject, so that like a child reading it could understand?
Yeah, I think it helps that I have spent so many years in the public schools. I've also been a foster parent as well. And so I have all of these experiences with different kinds of kids who've gone through things. And so I've been able to see, I don't know, I feel like sometimes adults think that things are too hard for kids because they don't actually interact with kids on a regular basis and don't know what they go through or what they're capable of handling. And so as a teacher, as someone who works a lot with kids, like I know what these kids are going through and I know what they can handle. And so it wasn't so much about like writing it in a way that like kids could understand, but more so reflecting the reality of a lot of kids that just isn't portrayed in middle grade books as often as it is maybe young adult.
For you, what made you want to be a children's author as opposed to an adult?
I don't know. I think it's just that I'm around kids so often that I wanted to contribute to that body of work. I think I have a lot of stories to tell that I haven't seen represented in children's lit. I do read a lot of children's books, just for my classroom, but also just for me personally. And so I know that there are more and more Latinx stories being told and being written, but it's still not enough. And so I would like to continue expanding those kinds of stories available to kids, and also just writing about the things that I know I can write about, like mental health.
And touching upon that, did you feel some kind of like, I guess, pressure to write a book on behalf of the Latinx community? Or I guess just because, like you said, there's more books being written about the Latinx community by Latinx authors, but not enough. So did you feel some kind of weight while, trying to write a book yourself?
Yeah, I think there definitely is that pressure of like, obviously I'm not speaking for everyone. My character is Puerto Rican like me, but there are many different ways to be Puerto Rican and many different Puerto Rican experiences. And I think, I just focused on writing the most like individual story I could. Like I wasn't trying to make my book this sort of universal story that would be appealing to absolutely everyone. Like I wanted to write a specific story and Yeah, in the beginning, I was a little bit nervous and sort of feeling that pressure. But as I've gone through the process, I've realized that that's okay. Like, it's okay to write specific, nuanced, like individual stories that aren't trying to kind of gather together a whole identity or anything. Like, I am writing about Ivelisse specifically. And, hopefully a lot of people will see themselves in her, but that kind of took the pressure off because I assigned her like specific identities and specific experiences. It took the pressure off a little bit on me to feel like I have to carry this load of a universal story.
And what is something you have learned throughout this whole process of becoming a publishing author?
I feel like I'm still learning. It's an industry where so many things happen behind the scenes. And so I really didn't know how much I didn't know until I was already in it. And so I think what I have found to be the most helpful is to find a community of people that will kind of mentor you and be your friend and hold your hand along the way. And so I was lucky to join Las Musas, which is a Latinx kidlit community of authors. And I have learned way more from them really than I have from anywhere else, because like I said, it's so tight-lipped. Like, people don't talk about a lot of what goes on in publishing online. And so I would spend all this time Googling answers to questions that I had and never really finding an answer. And so being able to talk to actual authors and like authors who identify as Latinx, who are writing children's books, was the most helpful to me, not just in getting answers, but just in feeling part of a community.
What is something that you do to help maintain your creativity and inspiration?
Honestly, I think just reading. Like, I read a lot. And I was worried that once I started working on my own books, I would kind of stop reading as much because I'm also creating these stories. But honestly, I think I'm still reading just as much. And I get inspired all the time. Like, I'll read a book and I'll be like, this is how I want to make my readers feel, or this is the kind of story I want to tell. And so that just kind of gets my creative juices flowing anytime I see another author do something really, really cool.
And what was your process like while writing Ivelisse Explains It All?
Well, I think my process for that book is just naturally going to be different from anything after it because I wrote it during the pandemic. And I was teaching virtually from home. And so my just schedule was very, very different. And I think that was one of the ways that I like escaped the stress of teaching virtually was writing that book. And I think I wrote it faster and just in a different headspace than my second book that I'm working on now. But it's also the one that I was just the most scared to write because it was my first one. And so I don't know, it was a lot of like sneaking in bits of writing when I could, like before teaching or after teaching. And, I kind of say it was kind of like having two jobs at once because I had to like focus on the teaching and then also focus on this book while everything else was going on. So it was not a fun time.
We also have a couple of questions from local Glendale team Logan, who wants to know from being born and raised in Puerto Rico to now living in Virginia, what has that transition been like?
I like to tell myself that it's not that different and it's not that hard because, the Puerto Rico is a part of the US and all of these things. And so I do think that me moving was a lot less difficult than it is for people who come here from other countries. That being said, I think the language is something that I do still struggle with. I've now been here almost 8 years. And every time that I go home, because my family is still all there, I'm just kind of struck by how nice it is to just be able to talk Spanish every day and to go get groceries or meet up with friends and just like everybody speaking in Spanish. And it's my Spanish too, because each Spanish is so different. Whereas here, like, even though in the schools I encounter a lot of people who speak Spanish, in my area anyways, there's not a lot of Puerto Ricans. So I don't get to hear that Puerto Rican sort of Spanish accent very often. But yeah, there's just something about, you know, being surrounded by the sounds of your home, that I think, you know, other things I can cope with in different ways. You know, I video chat my family, I call them on the phone, you know, I cook Puerto Rican food at home. So there's like a lot of things that make that transition easy, but I can't just make the people around me speak Spanish. So that's probably been the hardest thing.
Logan also wants to know, where do you find inspiration to write your stories? And more specifically, like, how do you create your characters, and where do that, like, the inspiration to create those characters come from?
Yeah, I think the inspiration comes from just all of the kids I meet along the way. And then that kind of gets mixed in with all of my experiences that I've lived with. So for example, in Ivelisse Explains It All, you know, she's a made up character, but there are things that we do have in common, you know, and so I do think that I have certain things, even if it's something really tiny, like in common with all my characters, or that remind me of people that I've met. And so I kind of just use that as a springboard. You know, it's like the one little thing that reminds me of someone or reminds me of myself. And then I just kind of take it from there. I think that even when I have a character in mind, that character naturally continues developing as I write the book, so that by the time I finish, you know, the end character might be actually pretty different from what I first envisioned, just because all of these things happen to the character like over the course of the book. And you know, sometimes you end up writing things you weren't planning to write, or things go a little bit different than you first envisioned. And so that process is always really cool to me too.
So one last question from Logan. He wants to know, now that you finished your debut novel, what is your next big goal that you want to accomplish?
Well, I want to keep writing. I have another book that'll be coming out next year, because it was a 2-book deal. So I sold 2 books at once to Random House. So I've been working on that book now that will be coming out next year. So yeah, a big part of my goal is just to continue writing. I don't want this to be just like a one-time thing. I would love to continue going and, you know, make a career out of it if I can. But also I want to see, you know, at this point, I haven't really seen people's reactions to my book, right? Like some reviews have started trickling in from advanced copies. And so, you know, I feel like because my book hasn't come out yet, like, yes, I sold the book, it's done, it's coming out in 2 months, but I feel like I still haven't reached that goal of like, I am a published author, because it's not out there yet and people aren't reading it yet. And so even though, you know, technically I've done it, I still feel like I haven't reached that first goal even.
And for someone wanting to pursue becoming an author, what is a piece of advice that you would give them?
I think definitely write a lot. Because practice does make you better. You know, my mom actually kept a bunch of things that I wrote when I was younger, and she sent them to me like a month ago. And it was so cool to see the really terrible stories I wrote when I was in 1st grade and 4th grade and 5th grade. You know, your writing does get better. So number one thing would be to just keep writing. Also keep reading, because like I said, just seeing what other authors are doing is going to help your creativity a lot. And then I would just say, have a really tough skin and a lot of patience, because it is a hard industry to get into. And so I think the best way to do it is if you can find friends who are kind of in the same process with you, that will make it go a lot better, because it is hard. It's hard to get an agent. It's hard to sell your book. And so you have to kind of believe in yourself, because a lot of people will be telling you no before you hear that yes.
Is there something that you would want to change in the process that now that you created your first novel?
Yes, I am. I'm trying to be more organized about it now. I feel like for Ivelisse, it was very much like a pantser sort of thing. Like I was just writing it as it came, and then I ended up having to do a lot of editing, and I also just didn't know like what the average length was for like middle grade books, or my book is in verse. So like books in verse obviously have a different word count. So I would go online, I would Google, and it would say, oh, middle grade novels are these many words. And obviously that didn't apply to me because my book was in verse. So now that I have an idea of like what a finished book looks like and what the process of revisions and editing looks like, I feel like I have been able to take that knowledge and then make like very detailed outlines for myself and write knowing where I'm trying to get to, as opposed to my first book where I was just writing and I didn't know where I was going.
And to you, what does all this mean to be a representation for Puerto Rico and to be able to create something that can help inspire others and also make others feel seen?
It means a lot. I mean, honestly, you know, even now, now there are more Puerto Rican books out there, but like growing up, I didn't read a single like kids book that was written by a Puerto Rican, because we, you know, we're either getting books in English from the United States, or we were getting books in Spanish from Spain or from Mexico. You know, the local literature scene isn't very big when your island is like 300 miles long and that's it. So, you know, I didn't have a lot of access to Puerto Rican children's literature when I was growing up. I feel like there are more adults writing, but not so much books for kids. And so even though now there's more, it's still such a tiny drop in the bucket. And so I love that I get to be a part of that for someone else. I love that someone else will grow up and be able to say, oh yeah, I read those middle grades by Andrea, and, you know, just be able to rattle off different authors and books that they've read where they felt seen, because I felt like I didn't have that growing up.
So before we end, we have some rapid fire questions. The first question is, what is your favorite color?
Blue.
When are you the happiest?
When I'm in the water, like swimming.
Knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self?
Oof, it gets better.
If you could have 3 people, dead or alive, for dinner guests, who would they be?
Honestly, I would have other Puerto Rican authors. Actually, I was in Puerto Rico recently visiting my family, and I was able to have a meal with Amparo Ortiz and Mia Garcia. They both write YA in English, so like me. And honestly, I felt like I was in heaven. I would love to be able to have more meals like that with more authors who are currently writing the sorts of books I want to read.
What do you want your legacy to be?
I mean, I would love it if my books like continue to be read years and years later. You know, if they're still in libraries, if Ivelisse is still in libraries like 20, 30 years from now, like that would be absolutely amazing.
What is a book that you are recently reading or currently reading that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I am currently reading an adult book. It's a memoir, but right before I started that, I was actually reading Treasure Tracks by Sally Ann Rodriguez, which is a really fun like scuba diving, snorkeling adventure. The kid is Cuban and Puerto Rican, and it's like a grandfather bonding story, and I love the ocean, so it was really fun to read.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andrea. We learned a lot about you. Thank you for taking your time out of your day to sit down with us and talk. Can you let everyone at home know about any upcoming projects and where they could connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, I am currently working on my second book, but it hasn't been like announced yet. There's no cover yet. But the place to find me is on Instagram. That's definitely where I post any updates. So when I do have the cover for that, that's where I'll share it.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure getting to know you and continue making amazing books. And I wish you nothing but the best. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.